And so the fact is, even though we generate all of this different waste and consume things like crazy, that's a concern, and it's a concern not just for the fact that nobody likes to have a landfill in their backyard, and there's been some really epic fights throughout the country in terms of landfill citation. Waste incineration has been a major issue in many municipalities. So how we deal with waste becomes a major issue. But in addition to that, waste is just generally bad for the economy, I would argue. Some people could make the argument that the more we consume, the higher our GDP grows. Well, yes, but the more we waste, the less competitive our economy becomes. The more efficient we are with our resources, the more efficient our economy is. And Canadian national competitiveness on an economic front is a major challenge. And if you talk to any of the different candidates kind of going around the country right now and said, hey, is national economic competitiveness an issue? The answer would be yes. Even though Canada is projected to be one of the leading nations in terms of growth in the G8, you've got China coming along. And I'm not so concerned about a lot of the other European countries, but China and India, I'll tell you, they're moving quickly on a lot of this stuff. And Canada needs to remain competitive because, and that relates to universities, but it relates to the environment as well. Making sure that we're producing educated people and citizens that are concerned about these issues and therefore doing their part to make not only the economy but the use of resources more efficient is only a good thing in my estimation. The good news. As I said, recycling rates are certainly increasing, and I think there are some really great emerging examples of how cities are coming up with creative ways to deal with this. Tomorrow I'll be speaking in Barrie about some of the actions that Simcoe County has been doing on their waste reduction and waste diversion issues. And while they've got challenges that they're facing, they're getting some really great programs in place to try and tackle those sorts of things. Whether that be having green bin systems, thinking about user fees for garbage, those sorts of issues. And it's those sorts of progressive policies that are really going to take those numbers and send us in the right trajectory. Another key finding, water yield. And water yield is a kind of a complicated thing. You can sort of use the term supply in general for what we're talking about, but it's certainly down in southern Canada while demand overall remains high. This is the trend line between 1970 and 2004 for southern Canada. And you can see there's a huge amount of variability in that because obviously weather from year to year changes a lot, and the amount of water that's available, the snowpack, the precipitation and so forth, how much we have changes considerably year to year. But the overall trend line is down some 8%. Now if that trend line continues, that becomes increasingly a concern because in face of that, if that's your supply, here's your demand. And that demand, while it's relatively stable, is incredibly high. What isn't necessarily coming out of that graphic is the fact that on a global level, that's double what most other G8 countries use. Britain, for example, uses nearly half of that. And so while the number is stable, it's huge. And that's just the water that's really coming and going out of our taps. That's the low flush toilet sort of situation. It's how long you spend in the shower. That's the number that's being reflected here, some 350, 320 liters a day. But that's really not where the biggest impact when it comes to water is. The big impact is this one. And that's a pretty huge number, 5,619 liters per person per day. And what that number is the amount of embedded water that we're consuming per day. And what I mean by that is when we go and we put on a suit, a piece of clothing or whatever, there was water that it took to make this. Not only in the factories where it was produced, but as we think back to the farmer's field where the cotton was grown. The food that we consume, there's water that's been taken from parts of the world. Maybe it's Canada, maybe it's other places. But there's water that goes into the products that we consume. So when we think back a couple of slides about that waste generation, there's a huge amount of water that's being consumed and wasted through all of those garbage bits and pieces, the cans that we're using, the food that we're throwing out. All of that is consuming water, and it's consuming a huge amount of water. why that is a major concern, I mean, in many cases, we get our t-shirts from China or wherever else, so we're consuming China's water. But we're a huge generator of natural resources overall, and we don't consume a lot of those resources. Those resources go to the States. You know, our oil goes to the States, our wheat goes throughout the world, our metals travel to Asia to be manufactured and so forth. So we've got a whole bunch of water that we're using in Canada, and it's not reflected necessarily in the numbers that you're seeing, those 320 liters, that's just residential use. There's a whole bunch of water that's going into our economy, and we're exporting that water. So people get up in arms when we talk about bottled water and exporting bottled water, or putting a pipe into our Great Lakes and sucking them dry, and how could the Americans steal our water? We're not going to let that happen. But we're exporting our water every day. We're sending it out through materials. And that's what we need to start thinking about. That's the issue. It's not necessarily how much we're consuming with our taps and so forth. Well, it's an important action, and there is a tangible impact upon places. I can think of an example where a few years ago I was canoeing on the Grand River here down in Kitchener. And you notice I always make the distinction between Waterloo and Kitchener. But we were canoeing down the Grand River, and and the Grand River is a beautiful river, but we got partway down, and I mean, a canoe doesn't require much water. It's like a few inches, and it was just grinding out on the bottom of the Grand River. And we had to pick it up and carry it 50 feet and drop it back down and go along. And that was middle of the summer. So the Grand River was going completely dry. And why that's an issue is that's where a lot of the water comes from Kitchener-Waterloo. And we can turn to things like aquifers and groundwater, but that just really shifts the burden. And we don't entirely know the impacts that we're having on groundwater in all places either. In certain cases, we're draining those dry, and those don't replenish as quickly. So there are major issues like that, and the implications of those sorts of things are considerable. So when we think about the well-being concerns on those sorts of issues, the fact is that the more water we use, and therefore the more water we run out of, the greater the technological solutions that we look to. We look to putting pipes from Lake Huron and pumping water back across. Those sorts of solutions have major cost implications. That in turn goes back to taxes for citizens. It goes back to manufacturing costs for companies. In addition to that, you know, as we have water pollution or we reduce the volume of water, we have challenges around water quality. When we have a reduction of flow and you continue to add the same amount of nutrients, your water turns green, and nobody really wants to go swimming in green water. And so those sorts of issues really relate to the broad spectrum of, you know, how we use our time, how we use our bodies of water for recreation. The linkages to other areas of well-being are manifold. There are good news stories, though, as always. In most parts of Canada, we have very strong water management practices. We have really strong laws, and we have good oversight on these sorts of things. That's not to say that there aren't challenges facing water managers. In many cases, they don't have the data that they require. They've had cutbacks on water quality monitoring stations, for example. And those sorts of things are major challenges. There's also increasing amounts of water-saving technology and policies that are being put into place. The way that we structure and price water in Canada is critical. And thinking about providing low cost for a small amount of use so you really benefit people and almost provide it for free, because it is a basic right for humanity. But at the same time, punishing people that are really using it and wasting it. And thinking about how we structure our pricing mechanisms so that we have something that's both equitable and at the same time efficient is really, really important. And kind of wearing another one of the hats that I wear, there is a huge growing awareness, not only of companies, but of the investment community, of the risk that water is going to play in the future. Because if we think about climate change and the impacts that are coming, many, if not most of those impacts actually manifest in the form of water. It's around too much water, too little water, and so forth. And that has material impacts not only on the economy, but on communities. And so the investment community, and I just came back from Washington, D.C. on this, they're building reports, and we're talking about trillions of dollars of investment money that is beginning to think about water as a filter for whether I should invest or shouldn't invest in an area, in a province, in a company, and so forth. So those are really material issues. And again, we need to think about that. Lastly, the kind of last key finding that I wanted to kind of speak about is the fact around our species. And unfortunately, a lot of the species trends are downwards. In particular, though, I'm wanting to point out to kind of the large fish species. This is sort of a set of data that aggregate a series of different species, and it uses numbers from 1970 to present. You can see in having indexed this to 1994, the trends since 1994 are generally downwards. That said, you know, they're comparable to where we were in 1970 in many cases. All that said, it's hard to entirely take full interpretation out of these numbers because we're not entirely sure whether the numbers in 1970 or the numbers even in 1994 were good or bad. Humans have been impacting different wildlife species in Canada since the 1600s, arguably since prehistoric times. And so where those populations should be at, especially in a sort of an environment that's constantly changing, is somewhat difficult to get at. And we don't entirely know whether those are all healthy or whether they're good or whether that's bad. What we can say is where the numbers are going more recently. And in general, we can say that higher numbers are usually better, or in fact, slightly or stable and slightly increasing might be the best, because that allows us to not have too much variability in the system, but still being allowed to use some of those species, because we do rely upon species for a lot of different things. Fish, as a sort of a specific area, are perhaps something that a lot of Canadians hear a little bit about, but I don't know that we necessarily have a really good sense of it, because while we can see forests, we can't see what's under the oceans. And this is a metric called the Marine Trophic Index, and it's a fancy way of saying how many big species do we have versus little species? How many, big top-level carnivores and predators do we have versus the little fish that get eaten? And you can see from this trend line that that number is generally decreasing. What that means is we're losing our big fish and we're replacing those with smaller fish most of the part. And while there are good examples of that, the cod collapse is a really good example, there are other species that are really showing signs of decline that are not only important economically, but important culturally to Canadians. And that ranges from everything from sharks to tuna that goes into sushi, to other sport fish that are really important from a recreational perspective. And so that has linkages. As we think about biodiversity, showing signs of major change and showing major signs of changes to food webs creates a lot of instability. And that becomes a concern because we don't know necessarily what the future will hold. Biodiversity it's an interesting realm, and it certainly has linkages to all of the other aspects of domain. Some people like biodiversity because they love to be able to take their kids out and show them frogs. That's what I did, Laurel Creek Nature Center, just outside of Waterloo. I played around with little frogs as a kid. Will those frogs be there for my children? That's something I don't know, and that's maybe what drives me. For other people, they might think of it as an economic resource, the lumber from trees, from maple trees or from pine trees. Other people in turn think of it as a spiritual aspect, and that has real importance to people. So we've got changes. Are those the kinds of changes that we want to see?